Hey, I'm Frostellian, and this is the second update for Unholy Death Knights. Legion is now in beta, so these changes went out a good while ago, but I waited to see if any other rebuilds were going to happen. Whilst there are some new things to talk about, it's more of a tuning and reshuffle. It's been a while since I did anything Death Knight related, and since the quantities have been changed again, let's quickly go through the core mechanics for new people, as that takes 2 sentences. All the different rune types are gone. You now have generic runes. To give you a reason to use Festering Strike, that now puts up 2 to 4 Festering wounds. The cap is still 8 per target. Scorch Strike breaks 1 Festering wound, and that's it. Essentially, runes are like combo points, but more wax on, wax off. Death Coil now costs 35 runic power, up from 30, and still returns 10 energy to the pet. The pet's DT Sweeping Claw ability now AoEs around itself as standard, not just a Sludge Belcher. This is a good change to provide more flexibility in that tier, but there is nothing else worth taking for PvE. The weapon effect of giving Sudden Doom an extra stack causes the timer to be refreshed back to 9 seconds, but not when spent, so you have to cast both within that new window, or hope for another proc to refresh it if you are trying to hold charges. Outbreak has no cooldown, but the effect lasts 6 seconds on the target. The duration of Plague is either bugged or the tooltip is wrong. Every second Outbreak is on the target, it refreshes the duration of Plague, which is normal, and how this and many other buffs work. So after 6 seconds, it should be left with 21 seconds, giving it a total duration of 27 seconds. Instead, it's starting with a duration of 27 seconds, and that is being refreshed, giving it a total uptime of 33 seconds. Mechanically, the longer the duration, the less globals you lose to it over time. But really it's a non-issue. It's just the actual uptime is almost 60% longer than the tooltip states. Wraithwalk is now on a 1-minute cooldown. It increases movement speed by 3 seconds. Still blocks effects and auto attacks, but now casting damaging abilities will cancel the effect. I still don't like the ability, but this iteration makes it much more useful than previous, and it's probably as good as it's going to get. Taunts are back for DPS specs, so Dark Command has returned. And the latest build put Death Strike down to 20%, so you really aren't healing much of anything by yourself. Something I realised I hadn't mentioned in previous videos was the location interaction between Scorch Strike and Death and Decay. Scorch Strike cleaves everything near its target when you are standing in D&D, so when you are using Clawing Shadows and the AoE is happening away from you, place the D&D under yourself, not the group, and then Clawing Shadows will AoE that group. You don't win any prizes for guessing my opinion on this, but if you're wondering about the loss of damage, 1 Clawing Shadows is currently worth 7 ticks of D&D. Unfortunately, when using Defile, it needs to hit something to gain stacks, so in that situation, pick something else or lose the buff. The active ability on the weapon, Apocalypse, has also been overhauled. It is now an instant on a 90-second cooldown, where it deals some damage and bursts all wounds on the target, with each burst wound spawning an army of the dead ghoul for 15 seconds. This is a simple cooldown to use. Get the stack to 8, press button. Since the damage of both the ability and the ghouls is very low, this is only useful to gain the random buffs once you get that trait. Before moving on to talents, the weapon itself also received a reshuffle of trait places, rather than an overhaul. The only real change was the Scourge of Worlds. They haven't fixed any of the issues I had with it, instead they went the other way and made it RNG. Which is a fix in a sense, but it means whilst you can try and game it, it interferes with the more basic rune mechanics, so really it's best to try and base it when you're about to clear wounds. It's a 6-second debuff on the target. I never saw it reapply itself or extend, but that doesn't necessarily mean it can't. But since you're looking at only 3 or 4 casts whilst it's up and 50% is quite substantial, it's likely you will end up immediately dumping any runes left to Scorch Strike, regardless of wounds or not. Okay, talents. Some shuffled and changed, and I'll put in the few that aren't new but I wasn't able to test previously. But I would like to say how utterly ridiculous it is to put in Diablo-style gating for respeccing talents. You can't instantly portal out and back to the same location, there's a delay, and you arrive at a random graveyard. Anyway, tier 56. All will serve, this is the extra pet. It's not new but didn't work consistently beforehand. Although it does still despawn at every opportunity, you can at least call it back now without relogging, even if you do have to dismiss your current pet first. And as there is no way to heal your pet, you are going to be dismissing and respawning them a lot. This summons a Risen Stalker that has 2 abilities. Skulker Shot is a 2-second cast for single target that doesn't appear reduced by haste, and Arrow Spray is an instant cast AoE. When faced with a single target, it only picks Skulker Shot, but with 2 or more targets, it appears to randomly choose between the two. There is no energy to check what it's doing, and the period between arrow spray and the quantity fired appears random. I could be wrong, but it doesn't provide any information about how it's choosing its abilities. Skulker Shot is undoubtedly overtuned, but because arrow spray starts at 2 targets, it is actually costing itself DPS when less than 4 targets, because 3 hits of arrow spray is just under 1 Skulker Shot. But the best thing about this iteration is that it is now responding to the passive pet action on the pet bar. No longer will it hold you in combat till you log out or run so far you've crossed into another zone. Bursting Swords. Festering Wounds deal 50% more damage when burst, and all enemies take damage within 8 yards. This is the latest iteration where the damage has been increased single target by 50%. The AoE damage no longer hits the originating target, which is currently set to 2/3 the damage of a Festering Wound. Since it's radial, it plays strongly with D&D Cleave, when you can prepare multiple targets in advance. Ebon Fever. Virulent Plague deals its damage in half the time. The dot ticks are simply doubled as expected. By halving the time, you double the ticks, so they now occur every 1.5 seconds. However, this appears to have its component split. The plague eruption quantity is unchanged, and since eruptions are the only part of plague that deals any real damage, it drastically reduces the effectiveness of this talent. As I mentioned before, plague duration is misstated, and similar issues are happening here. From 21 seconds, Plague's tooltip shows a reduced time of 10.5 seconds. You then add 6 seconds for Outbreak and expect it to end at 16.5 seconds, but instead it's ending 19.5 seconds, so it looks like it's halved the extension and added on 3 seconds instead. Comparatively, you can see the logical situations for each talent. The Archer is completely passive and will do sustain both single target and grouped AoE. Bursting Swords is an actively managed talent that gets strong with more wounds, therefore favours prepped AoE. Ebon Fever takes up more global cooldowns, but because eruptions aren't increased, it fills the same niche as Skulker, except Plague still functions on split groups. Tuning is by no means finished, but looking at damage, with my gear, a Plague tick is roughly equal to half a Bursting Swords wound, so it should be evident that whilst wounds are limited in their quantity and application by Festering Strike, and the rate you break them by both the global cooldown and rune regen, Ebon Fever never stops ticking. So if you're facing grouped AoE and have wounds on only one target, you can briefly provide similar output to Ebon Fever, but any time you aren't breaking wounds, and the instant those wounds are finished, you are losing DPS. But this is all moot, because the damage of the Archer in the current build puts him significantly ahead of everything else at all times, including the player. I don't expect that to persist alive, and this is the reason why I try to talk in terms of logic and mechanics rather than numbers. Tier 57, Epidemic. Causes each of your virulent plagues within 100 yards to flare up, dealing damage to the infected enemy and additional smaller damage to all enemies near them. This has been moved here. It now costs 1 rune and has 3 charges on a 10-second timer reduced by haste, and it no longer spreads plague. The AoE component no longer affects the original target, but its damage has also been increased, such that it now out-damages Clawing Shadows at 3 targets without Festering Wounds or Necrosis. But it's unreasonable to assume you manage to stack wounds multi-target most of the time due to the nature of waves of adds, or on more than 3 targets with Council, so you're usually looking at above 4 targets. Because it's on a cooldown, using 1 charge as you start and holding the other 2 for after D&D ends, that way you will have that charge back and will have used Scourge Strike during AoE without losing the better damage from Epidemic, as it's possible to use that at any time, assuming of course things are still alive. But it's now in a weird position that by actually making it useful, it ends up breaking the new mechanic of cleave during D&D. I'm happy to say again that I thoroughly dislike stationary cleave for a primary AoE as a concept. If they want to make Epidemic the new and improved Blood Boil, that's great, it's a genuinely better version, but I'd be surprised if this level of damage survives launch. Pestilent Pustules has been changed again. Every 5th wound you burst grants 1 rune. It's mechanically simple, does what it says. The major flaw is that there's no visible stat counter, but the idea has a couple of gameplay implications. Single target, it's fairly bland, and it's just sustained DPS, because it's simply returning runes back over time. And it also makes Apocalypse return a rune or 2. But in AoE, it becomes central to planning cleave. Say you have 3 targets, you would get the counter to 4, then stack up wounds on all 3. Once D&D is down, you'd cleave Scourge Strike across all 3, meaning you'd return the first 2 runes used, and then on alternate Scourges thereafter, which solves the issue of running out of runes early on. but by the same logic, from single target going into wave of adds, you will get 1 rune, possibly 2, back over the entirety of D&D. It's also worth noting this doesn't work on wounds left on a target when it dies. Those only return the runic power to you and don't interact with anything else. Blighted Rune Weapon. Your next 4 auto attacks infect your target with 2 festering wounds. Not much to say, this iteration of 4 and 2 is quite solid. It's a buff on you that delivers 8 wounds, freeing up all runes to be used on Scorch Strike. It also ties in with Unholy Frenzy, that I'll come to next. To compare the tier, assuming Epidemic gets nerfed, that would be spread or sustained AoE, Pustules is sustained single target or short AoE, and Rune Weapon is burst single target, where I'm using the term burst very liberally. 58. Unholy Frenzy. When a wound bursts, you gain 100% increased attack speed for 2 seconds. The buff extends, so no risk of overwriting, and affects all things working off auto attacks like Sudden Doom. When combined with Blighted Rune Weapon, it generates a net of 1 wound per Scorch Strike, so make sure you don't overcap. Currently single target, auto attack is the largest part of player damage, which is a little depressing, but it's down to having your damage divided up between so many other things. So increasing auto attack is not such a poor option, but does require high uptime. Castigator. Each Festering Strike crit applies 2 additional Festering wounds, and every Scorch Strike crit bursts 1 extra Festering wound. The theory of this muddies the wound system a little bit, but not hugely, considering the number of other things that are also interacting with it. But this is the only part of the entire spec that puts any emphasis on crit. It synergizes well with pustules in general, and that in turn with bursting sores. So it's possible crit could have some value, but if you went through the more logical route of Mastery Haste, you would still get comparable effects from pustules and sores, but this talent becomes ineffective, which is some very strange gear dependency to throw in when crit is counter to the general logic of the spec. What this means for AoE is that when combined with bursting sores and pustules, your AoE during prepped D&D becomes better by a random amount, because you could end up breaking all the wounds rather than just most of them. The most important aspect of this is that it can trigger from both parts of Scorch Strike, which means you should be maintaining a minimum of 3 wounds on a target before scourging. And this brings me back to what I talked about in the previous video. The rates of wound application versus consumption are skewed heavily towards consumption. If you only ever paired a Scourge with a wound, and look at this from a hypothetical 100% crit rate, you would generate 4 to 6 wounds and break 3 every time, resulting in lots of downtime because Festering Strike still costs 2 of your available 3 runes. Clearly, we don't have 100% crit. You would be lucky to have 20. But there are 3 things you are rolling crit for. 66% of the time, you will be rolling on something that consumes an extra wound. The only solution for balance is to have an unequal probability, but it's not a proc, it's tied to crit. It doesn't make the generation aspect any simpler either. If you don't want to overcap wounds, your maximum fester could yield 6 wounds, meaning you shouldn't fester above 2 wounds or you risk capping. So you end up with a very simple outcome: 2 wounds or under, Festering Strike; 3 wounds or over, Scorch Strike. If you don't have enough runes to fester, you wait or play the probabilities of costing yourself damage. And now add in the tier set that is Death Coil triggering wounds, and you'll very rapidly see Festering Strike as the most occurring ability. And then combine that with a legendary, giving Scorch Strike a chance to break an additional 1 to 5 wounds, you could end up triggering an entire stack of 8 off a single Scorch Strike. There is way too much demand. Of course, you are dealing with the probability of overwriting, and thus you have some margin within the range, but in general terms, the sheer volume of spikes on both sides likely renders the wound system pointless. Moving on, Clawing Shadows is still here, but has no changes. So, comparing the tier, Frenzy will be useful for high uptime single target because the increased quantity of sudden doom procs will increase your total rune rate. Castigator kind of approaches that same role differently, but it's attached to crit and is therefore totally random. But it could work in AoE, phase DPS, or when uptime is broken. Although when uptime is broken, it's most likely down to poor mobility. And then you'd be taking Clawing Shadows, because you're going to be spending your day running after things like a Benny Hill movie. Tier 60. Only thing changed here is Asphyxiate. It's now an instant cast on the global cooldown with a 45-second cooldown, and remains a 5-second stun with a 20-yard range. PvPers might worry about the cooldown, but from a mechanical standpoint it works just fine in PvE, so I don't have any more problems with it. Although you're always going to be taking Sludge Belcher, so this is largely irrelevant. Tier 75. Lingering Apparition. You move 30% faster during Wraithwalk, and its cooldown is reduced by 15 seconds. So 100% speed, only 45-second cooldown. This is your option to move slightly more often, but only unless you are taking no damage over the same time period, which is unlikely because then healers have no gameplay, so my expectation is you'll still be taking Corpse Shield as the default choice. Tier 90, Shadow Infusion. While your ghoul is not transformed, each Death Coil will reduce the cooldown of Dark Transformation by 5 seconds. It's also affected by Sudden Doom, and does what it says on the tin. Base uptime of DT with weapon is 26 seconds, so you have a cooldown of 34 seconds. Factor in the total time casting Death Coil against the time required to reduce, it amounts to around 5 or 6 coils depending on your haste, which is roughly 8 seconds if you chain cast. However, there are some issues with chain casting, making this talent inherently weak. Because there is no blood tap, the entire spec is built around weaving Death Coil to manage runes or make use of procs. Spam casting Death Coil to the exclusion of everything else is irrational, and every second you are not reducing the cooldown is in turn reducing the value of this talent. Necrosis. Dealing damage with Death Coil causes your next Scourge Strike to deal 25% increased damage. This is a buff on yourself, triggered every time you cast Coil, and combines with Scourge of Worlds, as one is a buff on the player, the other on the target. However, this overwrites and doesn't stack or extend, which means you should never double cast Coil. This is itself a little awkward when you run out of runes, as you are faced with the decision to either double cast trying to proc Corruption, wasting a proc but potentially gaining runes back faster, or only casting once, waiting for runes to return, and hopefully having just enough time left on the buff. Importantly, because there's a buff on yourself, it works with Scourge Strike Cleave, which then puts it in a weird position. Because on one side, having each Scourge Strike deal 25% extra damage, every 4 targets is effectively 1 extra Scourge Strike. However, to achieve this, you need to drop a global cooldown for every Death Coil to keep rebuffing the following Scourge, reducing the total amount of runes used during D&D, and in turn extending the time it takes to push through those same runes. So let's do an easy example with, say, 8 targets. Necrosis is therefore worth 2 Scourges, and by proxy 2 targets. If you get 7 runes over 10 seconds with a 1.3 second global, and being generous by not counting the 2 runes lost to D&D and Outbreak, if you put all 7 runes into Scourge, you would end with a total of 7 times 8 or 56 Scourges. Now, assuming Necrosis is already present, weaving in Death Coil, you lose 3 of these 7 globals, so 4 times 10 is 40 Scourges, with 3 runes unused. So clearly in this situation, it doesn't pay to use Necrosis when you have a glut of runes. However, most of the time you aren't going to have that many runes. Factoring in D&D, Outbreak, Epidemic, and potentially bad Corruption RNG, you might have at best 3 runes available. But even then, you need to know how long the ads will be alive for. Is it enough time to weave all 3? Then yes, clearly weaving will do more. But if the ads die quickly within 2 or 3 seconds, then you have the same problem as with the glut, and slightly more damage per Scourge is less than an entire round of Scourges. So again, Necrosis would do less. The other part of Necrosis is the interaction with Scourge of Worlds. Whilst it does stack, that is only up for 6 seconds, or 4 casts. Again, depending on your resources, it could be worth weaving coils between Scourges, if say you only have 2 runes left. The assumption being that you are unlikely to proc a rune back from Scourge Strike, or reproc the weapon, so you should maximise the damage of what you have. The last thing to talk about is because it requires weaving, you risk proccing Corruption with every coil, so you really need to judge when you can spend your runic power to maximise the chance of returning runes and not overcapping them. And this changes Death Coil's position in the order that instead of just casting it once you've spent all your runes, you want to be using it further up the chain before you scourge the last rune of a set, or even several runes of a set. This also means that it forces sustained DPS. Pooling runic power is no longer a good idea, because every time you coil without scourging, you lose damage. So whilst you could potentially use pooling for a burst switch, the target would have to be alive long enough for the extra globals used for weaving coil, which would then be effectively doubling the time, meaning you can't really call it a burst switch anymore. Infected Claws. Your Ghoul's Claw attack has a 35% chance to cause a festering wound on the target. There's no mechanical change to this ability from the previous videos. I've included it because this has been moved and nerfed to 35%, but it does still synergize with the other wound talents earlier in the tree, resulting in a build of Bursting Sores, Pestilent Pustules, Castigator, Infected Claws, and probably Soul Reaper. Comparing this tier, what you have are decisions around rotations. Higher pet up time, where if you focus it, it'll likely cost player damage, but given the Abomination has an AoE part, you could argue it's an AoE ability. Versus Necrosis, a change to the ability order and playstyle that focuses on sustained DPS. Infected Claws is the only talent in the tier interacting with wounds but is completely passive, and so leaves your gameplay unaffected and as standard. So this looks like it will be the beginner's choice. Tier 100, Dark Arbiter. Instant cast, 3-minute cooldown, replaces Gary. Summons a Valkyr to attack the target for 15 seconds. Gains 1% increased damage for every 1 runic power you spend. This is the new iteration of Arbiter, and is now a proxy for Breath. It's on the global cooldown, and the Valkyr's cast time is 2 seconds reduced by haste. But since it takes a moment to spawn before it starts casting, and the increases are applied during casts, you can get 2 coils off before the first cast. It's also affected by sudden doom, but realistically you'll only be getting around 7 or 8 coils into it by the end. Even going in with full resources, 2 doom procs in Apocalypse, it takes time to rebuild runic power. Of course, because the duration is fixed, and both the global and the casts are reduced by haste, you will be able to increase total stacks through higher runic power throughput. But it won't be much, 1 or maybe 2 coils at a push, and the nerfs to shell soaking mean that's all but gone as a tactic. Because this is another talent focusing on dumping runic power, it falls into the same issues I just covered with tier 90. With Necrosis, that actively lowers player damage through missed procs, and if it turns out that it's actually better to just summon and weave like normal, you kinda have to wonder what the point of the scaling was. As it is, it does look better to be dumping as much runic power as possible to scale it up, but in either direction, you are losing something, and it also runs into this problem again with Scourge of Worlds. When in combination with Shadow Infusion, it's also kind of strange. The main reason you'd use Arbiter is to burst down something. That would also include having DT running at the time, except that now you're having to burn through all your runic power to fund the Valkyr, leaving none to bring back DT, thus devaluing Infusion. If you triggered both at the same time, you would have 11 seconds to rebuild some runic power, but you won't always have that. And bizarrely, they both work together when DT has just fallen off and you are trying to bring it back quickly because they both feed off Death Coil spam. But that negates the purpose of stacking damage and bursting with Arbiter in the first place. However, this is all assumed mid-fight. It still has exactly the same problems at the open as Breath, because there are still no mechanics to generate runic power out of combat, and soaking has been nerfed heavily. You are left scrambling to get as much runic power as possible to catch the end of potion and trinkets. This lack of opening runic power has been a serious irritation throughout the whole of Warlords, and it looks set to happen again in Legion, and since this is a talent reliant on runic power, it means it's back to the same race issues. If you are not a Blood Elf, you are wrong. Defile has a new iteration. It does the normal Defile stuff, but no longer breaks wounds. Instead, it increases your mastery every tick, stacking up to 10 times for 6 seconds. The mastery buff functions like other buffs in the spec like Outbreak, and starts at 6 seconds and is refreshed every time it ticks. It has to hit something to gain a stack, but it does not gain stacks faster by the quantity of things hit, just by tick. And the amount of mastery given is not affected by gear, because the mastery buff persists after the effect ends. It naturally synergizes with pure shadow damage abilities, such as Epidemic, making holding charges for the end that much more effective, and doing a small amount for single target by making clawing shadows deal roughly 4% more damage, which can then be increased by Necrosis for a total of 30% more than a standard clawing shadow. So the focus is on dumping resources near the end of Defile. Lastly, we have another iteration of Soul Reaper. Strikes an enemy's soul for shadow damage and affects them with Soul Reaper for 5 seconds. Bursting a wound during Soul Reaper grants 7% haste for 15 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. There's a couple of things to this. The haste is a flat 7% added onto the char sheet, so 21% haste in total. The duration of the buff is refreshed every time you add a stack, but because it's instantly applied and the window for application is only 5 seconds, you also need to deduct the global used to apply it. And with the global being so long, you have to immediately chain cast 3 Scourges, otherwise you physically cannot get all 3 stacks. Whilst this will again have some negative impacts with coil weaving, it's less visible than having to waste buffs spamming coil. However, there is a small kink in the requirements. You need 3 runes for Scourges, and you also need a 4th rune for Reaper. But you only recharge 3 runes at a time, so you have to make sure that when you start the process, you will have the returning set of runes within range to chain Scourge into them. Otherwise, you're in the somewhat comical position of intentionally breaking the rune recharge rate by holding or delaying a rune in order to gain a buff that very slightly increases the rune recharge rate by nowhere near the amount you lost holding the rune. If holding was your only option, I would suggest only taking 2 stacks. But because it's on half the time of Apocalypse, you'll only get this problem every other Reaper, as you would otherwise be combining them. Or, of course, you could be using Castigator and clearing the wounds early. Comparatively this tier, I'm not particularly enamoured with Soul Reaper. Arbiter is useful for single target burst, which isn't in general gameplay outside of raiding, so I tend to stick with Defile and try to make use of the extra mastery. In conclusion, I have now played every DPS spec in Legion, and Unholy is still high on the list for those requiring sentient thought from the player. But when compared directly to the absolute control of Warlords, resource management and gameplay has taken a significant hit. Since we are now 3 months from launch, I'm not expecting any major changes. If we look back on the spec from where it started, it's much better now. It would be nice if everything interacted in a logical manner and talents were positive outcomes for different situations. But overall I guess it's okay, and most importantly, it does work. And that's it, I think. The next piece of Unholy content would be a guide around pre-patch, hopefully beforehand. So as ever, feel free to leave any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.